I was then transferred to the counter-subversion section, which looks at the anarchists and the Trotskyists and so on, and the far right to a certain extent. And there I was involved in vetting candidates for the 1992 general election. So we got to see files on people like Arthur Scargill and Peter Mandelson and stuff like that. MI5 is the domestic security service. MI6 is the external service. But MI5 operate abroad and MI6 operate in this country, so that's not the strict distinction. MI5 as a security service does a whole range of things. It doesn't just investigate terrorists and spies and so on. It also works out how high walls have to be around air bases, document security and so on. But crucially, it formally assesses intelligence. So I got a fascinating insight into how Whitehall works. I was working to a much higher standard I would have normally done for someone of my grade in MI5 because I was doing Lockerbie. And I have to say, the idea that these overeducated people from Oxbridge are all super bright with their double-starred first but are completely useless practically is absolutely true. These people had brilliant degrees, but they had no idea of any kind of practicality whatsoever. The intelligence services have far too much power and far too much secrecy. The real power, I believe, from my own experiences, resides in MI6 rather than MI5. MI5 is generally seen as a kind of lower public school, grammar school culture, whereas MI6 is a higher public school culture. It's quite often a family thing. The way they keep people on side to do unethical things is because if they were to blow the whistle, they wouldn't just be falling out with their employers, they'd be falling out with their entire family social network. When we get to that level of secrecy, it's very difficult to know who's pulling whose strings. There is one argument that MI6 is in fact the one pulling the CIA's strings. The other way, but it can also work the other way around, that because the CIA is subject to freedom of information, when they want to do something really nasty, they get MI6 to do it because they're not subject to freedom of information at all. I advise anybody to blow the whistle who knows about anything seriously going wrong. They may do all sorts of things to you. They may even kill you. But in the spiritual long term, it is far better to be a martyr for the truth than it is to be a conspirator against mankind, causing murder and torture and mayhem.
Hi David, how are you today?
Good.
Can you just start by explaining a little bit about your background, very slowly, what your childhood was like, who you were as a child, where you grew up, etc, etc?
Yeah, my childhood background was a working class background in the northeast of England. One of my grandfathers was a steel worker and my father was originally a draftsman at the same company, Dorman Long. And my other granddad was a parks gardener. So for the first 9 years of my life, I grew up in a working class background, but at the same time, obviously, my father was progressing within a company structure through management and so on, so we became more lower middle class. But I do believe that's what distinguishes me now from general middle class people, including my brothers who are younger than me. Because at the age of 9, we moved down to Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire. Which,
from where?
From Marton in Middlesbrough. And obviously Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire is one of the most affluent areas of the country, very, very middle class, very pushy parents, things like that. So the first 9 years of my life I grew up on one side of the north-south divide and all the class connotations that come with that. In the north east of England, you will know your next door neighbours, simple as that. You move down the south, you won't necessarily know your next door neighbour, you'll work in different places and so on. So I have seen the class divide of the country from both sides, and I still believe that the values I was taught by my maternal nana, who was a remarkable woman, are the values that I live by now. What kind of values are they? The values of the old dignified working class. They were poor people, but nevertheless had dignity. You know, if somebody came round, there'd always be a spread on for them, that kind of thing, even though they didn't have very much money. Very simple philosophy in life, and I do believe they lived by the do as you would be done by philosophy. people talk about the working classes being racist, and yeah, some of them were, but there was a whole lot more working class people I met who would say to those people, look, we've been oppressed, why are you oppressing other people?
What kind of food did your mother cook for you?
I'll say very much early on it was the bacon and eggs for breakfast and things like that. Once we moved down south, it was all bran and muesli. I went from a world of things like Sunday night bath nights and sleeping in vests to duvets and power showers, basically.
Okay. And what did your parents do for a living?
My mother was originally a secretary, gave up work when she had children, as women did in those days. But then after we grew up, she was a nursery school teacher. My father, as I say, was an engineer. Although he left school without any qualifications, he worked his way up and became a member of the Chartered Institute of Mechanical Engineers. My father had a brilliant mind, brilliant mathematical mind, one of those people very good with odds and betting and statistics, things like that, which is the complete opposite of me, of course. But my middle brother Phil is very, very much like that. Even though I'm the eldest, he was more kind of brought up in the mould of my father, if you see what I mean.
And did you go to school?
Yeah, I mean, just to complete my family background, because there were 3 boys and my father, very, very male background, very competitive, in a good-natured kind of way. Obviously, occasionally it would spill over, but lots of emphasis on playing sport. I played all sorts of sports when I was younger. I absolutely loved football. I'm still a Middlesbrough fan now, even if I'm slightly lapsed.
Okay.
What will I say about my childhood? I mean, I'm now 55. I was growing up in the late 60s, early 70s. The childhood I had was a childhood that had been the same for thousands of years. You know, we went out and we made fires and dens and played in the woods. And I can even remember at the age of about 11, you know, my mother would let me go off my bike to the local Lido, which was 7 miles away, you know. Whereas now, kids are constantly on a leash, basically. And it actually deprives children of the single greatest skill you need in life, and that's the ability to be able to make friends, to understand the people you get on with, and so on. That essentially has been taken away because, you know, the best in the world, middle-class parents are shepherding their kids' lives, and they're not really doing them any favours. They're not preparing them for a proper life in future. So I had what would be called a kind of traditional childhood, basically, which was normal for anybody of the day.
Did you go on to college and university?
Yeah, just to say, when I moved to Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire, it was a very, very different society, very middle class, very pushy. As a result of that, I raised my educational standards. I had actually spent 2 years in, it was a state school, but it was an experimental school. Teesside was obviously very left-wing, very keen on its socialist experiments. And I went to an open plan school for 2 years, from the age of 7 to 9. And in this school, the teacher would give you your assignments for the week and expect you to hand them in by Friday. It was up to you to take your break when you so pleased, and so on. Now, I'd struggle with the discipline to do that now at the age of 55, let alone the age of 8. So my education completely fell apart, even though I'd been quite naturally bright to start with in a traditional educational environment. So when I arrived in Beaconsfield, I really was the thickie, basically, with all these very intelligent, very articulate kids around. But that stretched me. It stretched me and got me to raise my own standard of education. I did take the 12 plus. I passed to a grammar school, but not the very best grammar school. My brother went to the Royal Grammar School on the other hill in High Wycombe. I went to something called the John Hampden Grammar School. And I do believe that I had an excellent education there, because it was not a traditional grammar school. It didn't have all that school stuff and everything. And quite a few of the teachers had actually gone to the school in the 60s and then come back to teach in the 70s. One of my form teachers had actually drummed with King Crimson, for example. So it wasn't overly disciplinarian as well, which I liked, suited my style, basically.
And what were your strengths academically?
Always in things like English literature, writing, art. In fact, I still hold a great bugbear against the state education system for stopping me developing my artistic talent by stopping me drawing freehand. A few years ago, I was clearing some things out at my parents' place, and I found these drawings I did freehand when I was 10 of lions and tigers, and I couldn't do that now. And yet, when I'd gone to school, of course, it was all about tracing stuff, not doing things freehand. And what I tried to do at that point was, as anybody will tell you as an artist, was to learn technique first. How do you paint a pine cone? How do you paint grass, trees, human faces, and so on? But they were all talking about, self-expression. But self-expression do you really have at the age of 13, 14, 15? You need to learn technique at that stage when you're less self-critical and more open to learning, basically.
Do you feel that took away your ability to observe through the art?
It didn't, because I'm still observant. One of my art teachers once said, art is not about teaching you to paint or draw, it's about teaching you to see the world. And that whole observance and awareness coming full circle is something obviously I now teach spiritually. To give you a very good example of this, obviously I worked against the IRA when I was an MI5, but if you're observant you can avoid getting a kicking. I used to, if people came up to me with Northern Irish accents, I'd look at their tattoos. If it said up the Ra, I'd say, well, you know, I'm giving evidence for the bloody Sunday inquiry against the British Army, and they go, oh yeah, great, buy you a drink. If it was, if they had, you know, the Union Jack on there, it would be, well, I put IRA terrorists behind bars. So you can play these things if you are aware and observant. People bring a lot of problems on themselves through their own sheer ignorance and lack of observance.
Just coming back to what you were talking about, the college, what did you study at college and where was that?
I finished up going to Dundee University. At grammar school I was quite bright. I became quite motivated at the age of about 15 and started to become one of the top pupils, and there was obviously talk of me doing the Oxbridge entrance exams and things like this. Unfortunately I messed up my A-levels and I didn't have a place and got to Dundee University through clearing. But again, this is one of the best things that happened in my life, a bit like not going to the posh grammar school. Going to Dundee meant that when the editorship of the student newspaper was vacated, I did it because no one else wanted to do it. I just stuck my hand out and said, well, no one else is going to do it, I'll give it a go. Whereas if I'd been at somewhere like Oxford, where it's massively competitive for CV points, I would never have done that. So I'd never had the experience of journalism that I got at college. Dundee was a funny university, had a very small arts faculty. It was mainly medical and dental students, so didn't have that kind of university ethos you might get at some more progressive universities. But again, I in some ways quite enjoyed that. I went to stay with a friend at Warwick University, which is in fact outside Coventry. It was a campus university. And after a week now, I was fed up of seeing students. I wanted to see somebody not wearing an earring, you know what I mean? Somebody who didn't have a funny haircut. And that's why I'm really glad about Dundee as well. I became a Marxist at the age of 17, rejecting everything from that Tory background in Beaconsfield, seeing what the Tories were doing at the time. And therefore, in my second year at university, went to live amongst the people in the working class area of Dundee.
What did you study?
English literature.
Right.
Although in Scotland it's slightly different. You do a four-year course because they have a thing called Hires.
So you graduated in English literature.
Yeah.
What next?
Actually, this is a funny story about my life that I used to illustrate my life. After I left university, I had been stringing stories to the national newspapers. When I was, just to give you first let me tell this story because it's quite important in terms of my development. In 1988, we managed to get a photographer into the medical students' initiation ceremony, which involved some quite humiliating stuff and taking advantage of young people who were just newly away from home. Some of them weren't even 18 because some of them got to Scotland University at 17. And so we did an expose of this. The expose, unfortunately, the medical students were going around showing the newspapers saying, aren't we clever? One of my friends gave the story to the Sun and the Daily Record in Scotland. All hell was let loose. I actually lived in the newspaper office at the time. I was that dedicated to it. And I can remember my girlfriend at the time coming down with a copy of the Sun and the Daily Record saying, Dave, you're not going to believe this, but the Sun and the Record have sold out everywhere in Dundee, and they're busting 200 copies of each one to each newsagent in Dundee, and the student newspaper's sold out. Now, obviously, doing a student newspaper is a totally thankless task. You virtually have to pay people to take it off you. But on this occasion, I remember going to restock the shop and people coming up with me and taking 10 copies and putting £2 in my pocket. So it was a great day of my life, but I then found what happens when you come up against authority. The university sided with the medical students and tried to have a go at us. They had a half-baked inquiry, and members of the student newspaper team were threatened, physically threatened by other people. I was nearly beaten up. Fortunately, one of my friends managed to intervene. So it gave me a bit of a dry run for blowing the whistle 9 years later, to see what happens when you stand up for the truth and to see how authority will react, but also how certain morons will react as well, who will become violent towards you and so So having done that, I then built up a relationship with the national press, and I'd already strung stories. So after I graduated, I applied for 2 jobs. One was with the local free sheet in Gravesend, and one was with the Sunday Times, the new graduate trainee scheme. And the free sheet turned me down, but the Sunday Times accepted me. And I say that little vignette illustrates my life in many ways. I do struggle with some of the most basic stuff, but in the high-end stuff, I'm fine.
What did you do at the Sunday Times?
Well, I was supposed to be a trainee. We worked in the news department for a bit. I then went to the sports department, and people said, "Oh, you're a footy fan, that's great." Wasn't. It meant that on a Saturday I couldn't go and watch Middlesbrough play, which is, my great love. And basically this was a slave labour scheme. Now, obviously my politics at the time, I was no longer a Marxist, but I was still quite left-wing. People were saying, "Well, why are you going to work for Murdoch?" And I said, "Well, look, if I can do this for 3 years, which is what the scheme was, I can then ply my trade on an English language newspaper anywhere in the world, basically. So it's worth me, knuckling down for 3 years under Murdoch to be able to then be able to do proper journalism elsewhere and expose things that need exposing." Unfortunately, after 6 months, they sacked me. And then I set up my own newspaper. So I ran a small business. My friend had a background in marketing. We produced a student newspaper that went out to 25,000 students in Scotland, a free sheet. But that collapsed in the recession of the early 1990s. And then I was basically just doing, I was a photocopier jockey for a bit to make ends meet, and that was when I saw the advert that says, "Godot isn't coming."
Now that leads us on to MI5. Can you explain to us how and why you wanted to work for that agency and how that came about?
Yeah, I will have to say to start with, I have never been a Queen and Country man. I come from the northeast of England, where there's an extreme cynicism about things like the royal family. That's all southern stuff, basically. Working class background where people, despite what you will see in the newspapers, are actually very quite cynical about that kind of thing. I've been an activist in the 80s, as I say. I've been a Marxist. I've been a journalist. So I wasn't the kind of profile you'd normally expect for MI5. MI5 was trying to also widen its recruitment base. So less emphasis on Oxbridge and public schools and more emphasis on people like me who were a bit more normal. But also people who had experience of doing other things. And obviously, so I've worked for the Sunday Times, I've run my own business. And the reason it happened was I was looking for jobs in journalism at the time, and I saw this advert in the classified section of the independent newspaper saying Godot isn't coming. Now, people who don't know, Godot is from a play called Waiting for Godot, written by Samuel Beckett, part of something called the Theatre of the Absurd. Now, I've done quite a lot of work on that play and the Theatre of the Absurd in general when I've been at university. In fact, Waiting for Godot was first written in French by Samuel Beckett, called En attendant Godot, and I'd even done it as part of my French literature subsid. So anybody wanting to attract my attention would know that the word Godot would attract my attention. Now, the reason I mention all of this is because I've now come to the conclusion this is what's known as a come-on in the intelligence services. Now, people will say, why would they have a come-on for someone like you? Well, in my student newspaper, to try and get it to sell, I'd published extracts of a book called Spy Catcher, which had been written by a former MI5 officer who alleged that MI5 had created a plot against Harold Wilson to say that he was a Soviet agent. Harold Wilson was the British Prime Minister in the 60s and 70s. And I'd published those extracts when they were under injunction, so technically I broke the law. Now, at the time, obviously, I made a very clever calculation that no one's going to go after a student newspaper. No one's going to go after a student newspaper. They just make a martyr out of me, of course. During my recruitment to MI5, I was obviously asked about this, and they asked me why I did it, and I said the intelligence services are not there to destabilise democratic government. And then they said, well, what about the national security implications? And I said, well, look, anybody who's going to want to glean the techniques of the intelligence service is going to do that when it was published in Australia in book form or America. They're not going to do it from my small circulation student newspaper. But I was asked that question at every stage of the recruitment process. So to start with, I applied to this newspaper ad not knowing what it was. I went to the first interview, which was a series of intelligence tests and a short interview. At that point, they're not saying what it is. You then get a phone call saying this is the Ministry of Defence, but it's not the usual Ministry of Defence. And my first reaction was, I don't work for the Ministry of Defence. And they said, oh, it's not kind of really the Ministry of Defence. I thought, what the hell's going on here? I can honestly say it never crossed my mind that it would be the intelligence services. It didn't cross my mind at all. It's only when I get taken to the second interview, we're in an unmarked building in London, in Tottenham Court Road. The building is not occupied, so I'm taken in there for this interview. And the interview begins with a question about my political beliefs and religious beliefs when I was 12, 13, which is extraordinary for a job interview. And as the interview goes on, they're starting to ask you about the ethics of intelligence. So you start to think, oh my God, this is the intelligence services. So they say, why do you think you're here? Who do you think we are? You don't want to say MI5 in case you're wrong. So you say, I don't know. And they say, oh, come on, you're an intelligent man. And I said, well, this must be MI5. And they say, yes. If you want to carry on the interview, you have to sign the Official Secrets Act.
Now, what is MI5 exactly, and can you tell us a little bit about its history?
MI5 is the domestic security service. MI6 is the external service. But MI5 operate abroad and MI6 operate in this country, so that's not the strict distinction. MI5 as a security service does a whole range of things. It doesn't just investigate terrorists and spies and so on. It also works out how high walls have to be around air bases, document security and so on. But crucially, it formally assesses intelligence. MI6 has no formal assessment function of the intelligence, and it does that for all security intelligence on behalf of government. Now, MI6 can't formally assess intelligence, but due to the old boys network, the old school tie and the Oxbridge network, they informally do so and put pressure upon people in normal government to listen to their intelligence. I have a very good example of this where they were trying to say that Iran was behind the Lockerbie attack, when all the evidence gathered by Dumfries and Galloway police and by MI5 in conjunction with other services had shown that in fact it wasn't. It was 2 Libyans who had at the time been indicted for the attacks. But MI6 used its information operations section to plant stories in the British newspaper saying Iran was behind those attacks because they wanted to go into Iran for 30, 40 years now. And we still see it even now to this day with the dispute over Iran's nuclear power, nuclear weapons capabilities and so on. They've always wanted to go into Iran. And therefore people who support the conspiracy theories about Lockerbie are giving support to those who'd wish to destabilise the world by having Iran invaded, in the same way the world was destabilised by the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq.
How long were you working for MI5?
I had 5 years in MI5, but I had some very good postings. My first posting was in the vetting section, so I got to see how all that worked, which has caused much controversy over the years for the exclusion of people with supposedly communist sympathies from areas like the BBC and the civil service. Although you didn't have to do much in the old days to get communist sympathies. I remember once seeing a file in which a kid had written to the Communist Party asking for information about communism for a topic he was doing at school, and he'd been recorded on a file. In fact, I got called in for a second security interview by MI5 because one of my referees had been a member of the Socialist Worker Party. And then when I was in MI5, I actually had a little sneaky look at his file. So that gives you an idea of the level at that point they were looking at. Anybody who was a member or sympathiser of any what they called Trotskyist or Marxist organisation was immediately given a file, and there were certain rules about where they were and weren't allowed to work, basically. Now I'd argue that the Socialist Worker Party is not a truly revolutionary organisation. It doesn't have safe houses, it has no armed capability. The Socialist Worker Party uses the techniques of democracy. It has demonstrations, it sells newspapers, puts out leaflets. These are all part of the democratic process, and as much as I disagree with what they say, I will, in the words of Voltaire, fight to the death for their right to do it. So it was very, very low level stuff, so I got to see that. I also got to see, I was then transferred to the counter-subversion section, which looks at the anarchists and the Trotskyists and so on, and the far right to a certain extent. And there I was involved in vetting candidates for the 1992 general election. So we got to see files on people like Arthur Scargill and Peter Mandelson and stuff like that.
Did you have to travel into an office every day? What was the working environment like, and did you have a code name?
The work at MI5 is very routine in one sense. You're largely desk-based. You have an in-tray and out-tray, and you're processing information like any other person who's in an office. However, what you're getting is agent reports from agents in the field, signals intelligence interceptions, telephone interceptions, interceptions from bugs placed in people's homes. And obviously you get it wrong. It's not like your company loses profits or your trade union loses some of its prestige. People die. So in that sense, it's a very serious job. There's a fear that if you got it wrong, people might actually die. But it was very, very much like a normal office. In fact, when I watched The Office by Ricky Gervais, which is currently celebrating its 20th anniversary, I could obviously laugh at that because it was very much like The Office in MI5. But I did go out and occasionally debrief agents. I debriefed what's called an SDS agent, which has now become very public as the Special Demonstration Squad of the Metropolitan Police. Now, normally MI5 would turn agents in organisations or feed them in the first place. This was slightly different. These were full-time police officers who were sent into these so-called subversive groups and would spend 6 days a week living as an anarchist and then would spend 1 day away from them living as a normal family man. Now, that's a 6-to-1 ratio in your life of being somebody else. And I actually believe these essentially agents provocateurs were behind the success of class war in the early 90s. Once this copper was taken out of class war fell apart, basically. But no real undercover stuff.
Did you have a code name?
I had an alias. Yeah, my alias was David Shayler, after a Middlesbrough footballer from the 1970s.
And what was your role specifically?
In counter-subversion, it was generally closing down that section. In fact, I famously wrote the paper that closed down MI5's 75-year study of communism that had begun with the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. Some of the first MI5 files, PF2 and 3, Personal File 2, Personal File 3, were Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Leon Trotsky. And I closed down that study after 75 years, which I'm very pleased with. And obviously the argument I made to MI5 was that we can no longer do this. Now there are greater threats from terrorists who pose a very, very direct threat to human life. But I certainly closed down the study of communism and anarchism by MI5.
What was it like as a job and how did it pay?
Pay was 10% better than a civil servant of the same grade, which is risible considering the responsibilities you have as an MI5 officer. It should have been parity with the police, but it wasn't. And that was because in the past, a lot of people who worked for MI5 were rich middle class people who worked because they did the right thing for the country. They didn't have to work. In fact, even in my day, there was one guy in MI5 who didn't get paid for a year and didn't notice. So that's why MI5 was not paid well, but they obviously hadn't taken into account that the people coming into MI5, like me, didn't have a private income. We weren't from rich backgrounds. But counter-subversion was just my first posting. I had 2 other very good postings. I was part of a section called T2, which was responsible for countering the IRA on the British mainland. The responsibility had been transferred from the Metropolitan Police Special Branch to MI5 shortly beforehand, and we took that role. And the new intake of people much like myself, not part of the old guard MI5 culture, very quickly got on top of the IRA. We had enormous successes through proper diligent intelligence work. We didn't have to cut any corners or fit anyone up or anything else. Didn't need agent provocateur. We just used proper intelligence analysis, and we put IRA terrorists behind bars. I had one case of a man called Sean McNulty, responsible for 2 attacks on a gas and oil installation in the northeast of England where he lived. And it came out at trial that if he put the bomb about a metre the other side, it would have blown up the whole gasworks and could possibly have taken down a row of terraced houses, causing mayhem. Now, I stress it was not the aim of the IRA to cause civilian casualties. They realised it was just bad publicity. So they had this very formal thing of an organised code word that both sides understood. So areas would be cleared before any bomb went off. And obviously they also used that for hoaxes. They could put one bomb down and do a warning, but say, there's bombs at these tube stations as well, so you have to close those tube stations. And obviously I lived in London at the time, so I knew what it was like to be standing outside my tube station waiting to get in to go home. But that was all part of the psychological warfare on the British people. I now would say that the IRA had the law on their side. They had the common law on their side because the British Army were occupiers of their land and persecutors of their community. And then the final posting I had was Libya Lockerbie. So I got a fascinating insight into how Whitehall works. I was working to a much higher standard than I would have normally done for someone of my grade in MI5 because I was doing Lockerbie. I was briefing people like the Chief Constable of Dumfries and Galloway Police, who'd been responsible for the criminal investigation. But I was also going to much higher levels in the Foreign Office and so on. So I got a real insight into how government works behind the scenes. And I have to say, the idea that these overeducated people from Oxbridge are all super bright with their double-starred first but are completely useless practically is absolutely true. These people had brilliant degrees, but they had no idea of any kind of practicality whatsoever. And obviously I worked on the Lockerbie issue. Now, from my point of view, Lockerbie was a wet dream, because when the Lockerbie attack happened in 1988, this was before I was in the service. Certain conspiracy theories had emerged in the meantime about, as I say, Iran being responsible, or Syria. So when I got to the desk in MI5, I had the conspiracy theorist wet dream. I could go through every MI5 file and see whether the authorities were telling the truth. And I did do that, and I came to the conclusion that there was evidence beyond reasonable doubt that both Lamin Fima and Abdul Basit Megrahi were both guilty of those attacks. One was convicted at trial, the other was let off on a technicality by a panel of judges. If it had been a jury, he would have been convicted.
I want to ask you what kind of intelligence MI5 hold, from the most trivial to the downright inappropriate?
Well, the problem with MI5 is that when I was there in the 90s, a lot of the people in management had cut their teeth with the mentality of Reds under the bed, which I don't think was ever a real threat in this country, despite the best efforts of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So I say all this very low-level information on people who just got involved in things like peace initiatives, for example, with people from the Soviet Union, got files, which is completely wrong. And I was also, when I was in the Middle Eastern section, I was drafted into an investigation that had already begun into a Guardian journalist. In MI5's argument that she was laundering money on behalf of the Libyan intelligence services. And this was risible again because the money was going through the official Libyan intelligence services accounts in London. Now the Libyans know MI5 can see those accounts. They're not going to use those accounts to obviously launder money. But that operation went on and on for a year. I tried to close it down. It was quite obvious from context on the telephone intercept that she was helping a man called Kojo Tsikata, an official from Ghanaian, fund a libel action against the independent newspaper. And I tried to say that to them, but they wouldn't listen to me. They kept on going with this operation. Even at one point, casting an idea that they were going to arrest this journalist's daughter so they could go and put a bug in her house when it was empty. And again, that was crazy. Now, when I get some perspective, though, MI5 was pretty useless, but there were some very capable people of my grade, and I say we did get on top of the IRA very quickly, even though there were some major mistakes, even though we were at times forced to apply for warrants that there was no case for, that we'd inherited from the Met. And the fact that MI5 lied to government as well in the McNulty case, before carrying out these attacks on the 9th of June 1993 at the gas and oil installation, he'd been photographed 12 days earlier at the house where somebody was coordinating the IRA's mainland campaign was staying. Now, that's key intelligence. You know, we know he's been there to get some kind of briefing. He's either tending a weapons side, he's going to take the weapons to somebody, or he's going to carry out an attack. But those pictures did not arrive in MI5 until 12 days later. Now, this is the early 90s. This is an age of, you know, telegraph and passing things over wires, even though it's not the age of the internet. And that obviously 12-day delay meant that McNulty could put down those two bombs and threaten human life, basically. And I made it very clear in what's called the operational report. You do like a page of A4 summary of your report that would be included in a bound volume, the first addressee of which was HMQ, the Queen, and the second addressee was the Prime Minister. And I put it in there that we'd had this 12-day delay because no one in MI5 would take it seriously. When I read the version that had actually finished up in the final report, my boss had boulderised it to make it look like the pictures had been taken the day of the attacks in the northeast and not 12 days beforehand to cover up MI5's errors. So that gives you an idea of how they will lie to government when it suits them to protect their own reputation, basically. And rather than learn the lesson from this as well, if something's gone wrong, learn a lesson. And they wouldn't learn a lesson. That's the problem. But that is the problem with anybody in a corporation. They'll always protect the corporation over and above doing the right thing.
You mentioned earlier that there was intelligence about a primary school boy. Is that usual? How appropriate is that? And what about ethics? That's
completely wrong, obviously. That used to happen pre-1990. Say counter-subversion was closed down in the early 90s. So at the time I was there, I don't think that kind of thing happened. But I say at the same time there was this investigation into a Guardian journalist based on absolutely nothing that wasted valuable resources. What people have got to understand is resources are always finite. So you've got to have your people in the right place because you've only got limited resources. To devote resources for a year to a Guardian journalist who clearly wasn't doing anything wrong takes them away from stopping real terrorists who are likely to cause death and mayhem.
Sorry, I just want to ask again. So was it common practice that MI5 would hold files about primary school boys?
This wasn't primary school, he was probably about 12, I think. But it was common practice that they would create files and anybody contacting the Communist Party for any reason. So in some cases that would be people who were not adults. But I say people who, Mark Thomas, the comedian, I managed to tell him he had an MI5 file, and that's because he'd been involved in organising some kind of festival or concert with the Socialist Worker Party. So they put him down as a Trotskyist sympathiser. And again, he's not there because he's a Trotskyist, he's there because he's trying to expose other things, and the Socialist Worker Party want to expose the same things as well.
Do you believe that the intelligence services have too much power, David?
Far too much power and far too much... The intelligence services have far too much power and far too much secrecy. The real power, I believe, from my own experiences, resides in MI6 rather than MI5. MI5 is generally seen as a kind of lower public school, grammar school culture, whereas MI6 is a higher public school culture. It's quite often a family thing. The way they keep people on side to do unethical things is because if they were to blow the whistle, they wouldn't just be falling out with their employers, they'd be falling out with their entire family social network. And that's how they keep them under control. When we get to that level of secrecy, it's very difficult to know who's pulling whose strings. There is one argument that MI6 is in fact the one pulling the CIA's strings. The other way, but it can also work the other way around, that because the CIA is subject to freedom of information, when they want to do something really nasty, they get MI6 to do it because they're not subject to freedom of information at all. And again, these are things that have grown up traditionally in this country. If you really wanted an effective anti-terrorist force, you'd completely reform it. And you'd separate the assessment function from the intelligence gathering function. But they're in many ways, say it's very difficult to know what's going on once you get to that level of secrecy, but what we have to understand is that there are many corporations running their own intelligence services now. The visible face of power in this country is the Bank of England and its control through the money supply. And we have to realise that the history we've been told about empires and revolutions and so on is not strictly true, because behind any of those things are the money men in whatever form they're in. The reason that Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome was because he was going to take control of the money supply away from the money men. Now, I've obviously looked at that period of history. If you take a conventional view, it's all about the fact he wanted to be the king of Rome, and Rome should never have a king, and therefore the senators nobly all agreed to put one knife into him. No, it's because he wanted to take control of the money supply.
Now, who are these families you say run MI5?
Again, I don't have any personal direct evidence, and if I don't have personal direct evidence, I'm not going to say. Obviously, there are the names that come up. There is a long history of how the Rothschilds took over the British economy, again including using essentially a false flag operation around the Battle of Waterloo. Initially, it appears that one of Napoleon's marshals was loyal to the British, and that's how Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. In every single war games exercise, Napoleon wins it, and when people reproduce it, and that's because, say, Napoleon was betrayed. And the second one, of course, was that the Rothschilds faked this idea that Wellington has lost the Battle of Waterloo, and therefore people want to sell British stocks. The Rothschilds have already set up shell companies to buy the stocks very cheaply. They then come and announce, in fact, that Wellington's won the Battle of Waterloo, so people want to buy those stocks, they all go up quickly. So over the course of about a year, the Rothschilds cornered the entire British economy, and from that position have manipulated kings and queens and parliaments and political parties since then. And that's all a matter of public record. The evidential trail to the Rothschilds emerged on the internet in the noughties. Now, clearly someone was laying a trail there, that was quite obvious. That doesn't mean to say that evidence is untrue, or is even selective evidence. All that evidence checked out, and it did not appear to be selective evidence. The problem is, though, the Rothschilds officially got out of things in 1998, would you believe? Apart from the Rothschild Merchant Bank. And this was after, of course, they'd been responsible for things like the privatisations of the 80s, the Big Bang in the City of London, in which essentially government transferred its power to the City of London, basically.
Now, who does MI5 serve and whose interests?
Well, in theory, as I say, the first addressee of every MI5 intelligence report is the Queen, so officially it's the Queen. I didn't swear an oath in MI5. I've had this thing from people who've asked me since I blew the whistle, what about the oath you swore? And my response to that is, I've never sworn an oath. And I wouldn't have swear an oath to Elizabeth Williams because I've never met her. Swear an oath to a woman, I've never even met her. So I've never sworn the oath. I didn't swear the oath in MI5. I never swore the oath in my life at an age where I could be held to have consent in law to the oath. I've since sworn the oath on a couple of occasions to clarify matters of fact in affidavits, which somebody can come to later on. But I think that's quite an important matter, where you do consent to the oath, obviously. That was the big issue of Thomas More under Henry VIII. A very famous play called A Man for All Seasons, in which Thomas More refuses to swear the oath to Henry VIII. But the principle of English law had always been that you don't have to swear the oath, you just consent to it by your silence. And More's interrogators on behalf of Henry VIII come up with the argument, this is not silence, it is an eloquent denial. And for that reason More is put to death. But that has always been a principle of English law, you don't have to swear the oath. But obviously, there used to be certain professions where you had to swear the oath. That's why they were called professions, because you professed an oath. But as far as I can understand, doctors certainly no longer swear the oath. People in government do. But the oath is very important, not because of the Queen, but because it puts you under the law. The true law of love your neighbours, love yourself, and do as you would be done by. So there was no swearing of the oath for me in MI5.
But you signed a Secrets Act?
I signed the Official Secrets Act, but I do point out to people there's no legislation you have to sign to be bound by. I didn't sign the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, but I'm still officially in their society bound by that, although legislation is in fact legal fiction. No one's bound by legislation unless they choose to be. But obviously I didn't know that until after my trial. Can
you explain to the viewers what the Secrets Act actually is?
Yeah, the Official Secrets Act came about because of some whistleblowers in the 1980s. Famously a man called Clive Ponting had leaked some information. And he had argued a public interest defence in front of a jury, and they'd accepted that. And so therefore what happened was the Conservative government therefore introduced new legislation to say that anybody in the intelligence services saying anything at all about MI5 was committing a criminal offence. Which is an extremely draconian piece of legislation within what is supposed to be a free and open society. And obviously I'd written articles about the 1989 Official Secrets Act when it was being passed as a journalist. It was therefore ironic that that's what they used to essentially shut down any form of defence I had. When I was put on trial, I was not allowed to freely cross-examine my accusers or freely speak in my defence, which are obviously two absolute principles of a fair trial.
Now that leads us on to my next question. When did you decide to blow the whistle?
Yeah, in summer 1995, my opposite number in MI6, a man called David Watson, whose name is in the public domain, came over to see me and outlined essentially a plot that had been put forward by what's known as a walk-in. You can either try and turn somebody in an organisation or you get a volunteer or a walk-in. And this man walked into the British Embassy in Tunis and said, look, I've got this group of essentially Islamic extremists together and we want to assassinate Gaddafi, but we need funding. And he outlined this to me. Now, at the time I was shocked because although people didn't know about Islamic extremism and Al-Qaeda until 9/11, the intelligence services already knew at this time that this was the new threat to the West. It was already coalescing in the Middle East and so on. How far it was funded and backed by the Western intelligence agencies is another question, but nevertheless that's what they were looking at the time. So I was quite surprised that MI6 were funding our new terrorist enemies to try and assassinate Gaddafi, who according to the MI5 assessments had renounced terrorism. So you're bumping off somebody who no longer poses a threat to British life, but the people doing it you're funding do pose a threat to British lives. So it made no sense in terms of an operation like that. Now I actually thought this would be more boys' own stuff, as I called it. MI6 often would come into my office and outline these outlandish ideas, then it would all go quiet and ask a few weeks later what happened, and nothing would have happened. So I didn't react to it perhaps as much as I should to start with. It was only when they put out what's called a CX report to Whitehall, communicating the idea that there was going to be this coup in Libya. And they do say that the man reporting on this is involved. They are indicating that Air Agent is involved in the attack. They don't mention payments, but the CX report does mention that the group is looking for the support of Her Majesty's government, basically. When I saw that report, I realised they were serious, and then about 2 weeks later, I can remember this really well, because it was just before the Christmas party that year, so it was about 2 or 3 days before my 30th birthday on the 24th December 1995, and he came in and told me they'd made payments to this agent in Libya to assassinate Gaddafi. Now at this point, I divorced myself from MI5. Obviously I should have resigned on the spot, but in the real world, we've got to pay the rent and so on. But at that moment, I decided I was leaving MI5. And obviously I had other reasons as well. I was approaching my 30th birthday, and I'd thought when I left college I was going to be some kind of crusading journalist or editor or something. I didn't think I would be party to a terrorist plot. And let's be clear here, in law, you are part of a conspiracy until you extricate yourself. I blew the whistle, although I didn't do this consciously at the time, but I now know this in law, to extricate myself from that conspiracy. If I just stayed silent, I would still be part of that conspiracy now and could be charged and convicted on that basis. So what happened was I then began to look for other jobs. In the intervening time, the attacks happened. And I didn't find out about them from MI6. People said, oh, MI6 boasted about carrying out this attack, to give you an idea of how great they were. No. I read about the attack in signals intelligence from intercepts on the Moroccan services and the Egyptian services, but the modus operandi, the way of the attack going ahead of putting a bomb under a car in a cavalcade, was exactly the way it had been outlined in the CX report that had gone out to Whitehall about 2 or 3 months earlier. So I knew it was MI6's man. I then confirmed that with MI6, and they said yes, that was our man. The reason Gaddafi wasn't killed was they put the bomb under the wrong cavalcade, the car in the cavalcade, but innocent people were killed. Reports indicated about 11 people were killed. That is an act of terrorism. Kills innocent people. I didn't want to be on that side, and so obviously we doubled my efforts to get out of the service, and about 6 months later I finally had another job and was able to leave.
So talk us through the outworking of how you actually blew the whistle on this plot to assassinate another individual.
I first met a journalist to blow the whistle in the summer of 1996 when I was still working for MI5. I thought about doing it to try and end this operation against the Guardian journalist I was talking about. But in the end I decided not to do that. So I started to form a relationship with them then. I was giving them a little bit of off-the-record stuff. I then left MI5, but by the December of that year, I kind of realised that I couldn't live with what I knew. My life has always been about telling difficult truths. That's why I chose to become a journalist. And it would be a betrayal of everything I stood for if I just quietly accepted that my country murdered people. And therefore, I told the Mail on Sunday I wanted to go on the record and do a story. Now, they ummed and ahed for a long time. There was talk of doing a book. To put a personal spin on this, I'm a crazy Middlesbrough fan, and at the time Middlesbrough were doing crazy things like going to Wembley finals for the first time in 1997 and losing them. But by August 1997, the Mail on Sunday decided they wanted to publish my disclosures, basically.
What was the name of the journalist?
I worked with two journalists, a man who was on the Mail on Sunday called Nick Fielding, and another man called Mark Hollingsworth. In fact, Mark Hollingsworth had actually written a book about vetting with Richard Norton-Taylor, the Guardian's intelligence correspondent, that I'd been given by somebody in the MI5 vetting section on my first day there to say, if you want to know what goes on in vetting, read this. So that was quite ironic. And I went to the Mail on Sunday's offices for 3 days, and we did a debrief. On the 22nd of August 1996, I came back to my flight in Pimlico, packed up. We were booked into a hotel. Saturday morning we left Britain and landed in Amsterdam. And that Saturday night the disclosures were published. Unfortunately, the Mail on Sunday did not publish my main disclosures about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. Now, this is quite funny, because obviously when things happen with intelligence, people don't know whether this is an official thing being pushed forward as not official, or whether it genuinely is somebody blowing the whistle. So there's this pause after I blew the whistle. People obviously followed up the story, but there were no more inquiries made in terms of trying to develop that for a couple of days. It was almost like people were trying to find out from their contacts in the intelligence services, is this guy a whistleblower, or is he part of one of your psyops or whatever, But eventually a Newsnight came over to interview me. I did an interview on Newsnight about the disclosures that had come out. Now, on the Saturday, we left Holland, because obviously at this point I'm on the run for the British intelligence services. You've got to keep moving. There's all sorts of ways they may be able to trace you. And it was when I was on a high-speed TGV train down to Bayonne that I learned from the Mail on Sunday the new Labour government of Tony Blair had taken out an injunction against me, stopping me from saying anything about the intelligence services in future. Now, people think this would be terrible, but that's actually been part of my plan. That if they take out an injunction and people know I've got something serious to say about the British intelligence services, that way the story will be heard. It'll go around the world, basically. And indeed, on the Saturday night, it was starting to go around the world. Saturday is a very slow news day, as journalists will know. Therefore, anything that happens on a Saturday gets major reporting. And the other thing is MI5 and MI6. People love stories about them across the world. So this would have been brilliant. It would have been across the world, and we would have been able to get an inquiry. Game over. That night, I went to bed thinking that. I got up the next morning, staying in a French hotel room. Obviously, I've lived in France a couple of times, so I put the telly on. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, there's a documentary about Princess Diana. I think, what the hell's this doing on French television this time of morning? Listening. Suddenly I hear the words, La Princesse Diana est morte aujourd'hui. Princess Diana died today. And it was just like, oh my God. We knocked out the headlines. This is going to dominate the news for weeks, months. We've blown the whistle on lower disclosures, not the main disclosures. We are in a terrible, terrible position there. But again, I say God looks after me. At that time, I really wasn't ready to take the other side on. I was exhausted from having worked in Babylon for years. The 40-hour week doesn't suit me. I'm not averse to hard work, but the whole idea of just having to be there 8 hours a day, and that kind of doesn't suit my mentality, doesn't suit my constitution. That's why I was so overweight when I blew the whistle and so on. Drinking far too much, was not in a good state of health. So that pause actually allowed me to rebuild my health and so on, to be able to blow the whistle properly afterwards. Now, I'm not saying they murdered Princess Diana to knock us out of the headlines, but if you've got a plan to murder Princess Diana because she's about to bear Dodi Al-Fayed's child, this was an excellent time to do it, because you killed two birds in one stone. And we all know that Diana was murdered. All the evidence is there in terms of the things we expect to see when they carry out an assassination. The CCTV is not working that would have captured what was going on in the tunnel. We know from witnesses there was a flash of light, 2 motorcycles that can't be accounted for, that are not paparazzi, because all the paparazzi have been accounted for. We certainly know that they tracked down somebody with a white Fiat Uno, but he said it was a different white Fiat Uno. That man was a man called James Anderson, was later found dead in a burnt-out car 200 kilometres from where he lives, and the French verdict was he committed suicide. Now, having worked for the national press, obviously I realised that blowing the whistle you may get some criticism. What I was not prepared for was the nature of that criticism, how utterly personal, aggressive and violent it was, how they made things up about me. They said I'd blown the whistle when I was unemployed. And at the time I was actually a management consultant, which I'm extremely embarrassed about now, but people do think was quite a prestigious job.
Which newspapers accused you of blowing the whistle because you were unemployed?
The Daily Mail, would you believe, the stable mate of the Mail on Sunday.
But I thought you said that it was the Mail that...
No, Mail on Sunday that published my disclosures.
And that was a good article, was it?
They gave a very good article, yeah. But the Daily Mail, who didn't like the fact they hadn't got the story themselves, then made up the idea that I was unemployed and that's why I'd blown the whistle. And obviously intelligence services went full on trying to have a go. One thing obviously I was extremely scared of was at the time I was a secret tranny, and I was dead scared they were going to somehow expose that to try and discredit me, which would be obviously a lot more effective than the world we live in now, when there's much more public acceptance of these issues. Also the fact I smoked weed I thought if it exposed me for that, I'd have a problem as well. But none of these things cause harm to a human being. All the things I was scared of being exposed for by the press were not things I had any reason to be embarrassed about or cause a problem to conscience. So my entire philosophy is about not causing harm to human beings. But nevertheless, I was worried that I would be exposed for those things at the time. What I found even more astounding was how when you tried to correct the record with these newspapers, they just wouldn't listen to you. Things that were obviously wrong, they would stand by. And that has been the problem in our society. And that has really affected things like, for example, the exposure of the truth about 9/11, which is completely and utterly vital to understand if you want to understand how the world works now.
I mean, how did it make you feel having those accusations hurled at you very publicly? How did it impact your mental health? And do you believe that this is almost a kind of a psychological torture?
Of course, this is psychological torture. Attack you in the newspapers to make you a public figure either of ridicule or hatred. What I'm surprised about is how many activists joined in with that. The idea that activists are good people is not the case. They are small-minded, bigoted people no matter what they say. If you're interested in politics, you've really missed the whole thing, really. So that's I found quite alarming. Now, obviously, when you get attacked like that to start with, you're not used to it. It is troubling, obviously, and you have days where you kind of wonder if you've done the right thing and you question yourself. They have been waging that psychological warfare on me now for 25 years. I can brush it off like that now. I can laugh at them and just put my stuff very calmly back at them. I deal with intelligence and rational analysis. I don't deal with calling people names. If people do call me names, I say, if this is a name-calling competition, I'll call your names back. Surprised you could spend so much time here away from buggering your kids, for example. Because I'm not going to play that game with people who've come there not to debate evidence and analysis. If they've come to call names, they will get names called back under the doozy would be done by principle. And I'm actually quite a lot better at calling people names of other people than they are with me. And I say, because I'm used to it, I can withstand that. And again, I'm eternally grateful to God for those tests. If I'd never had those tests, I wouldn't be the strong human being I am now. I wouldn't have the clear insight I have now. So that was all part of the process of being tempered to become a true spiritual being, basically. And there is nothing more spiritual than sacrificing your own livelihood to stand up for truth and justice for others, which has been forgotten by many, many people who think they are spiritual. Spirituality is not about tuning up your chakras, it's about helping an old lady across the road, to use a metaphor. And that's, again, something that they have manipulated. All these people who self-identify as Buddhists, who've never read the teachings of the Buddha, and are perhaps the most selfish, up-their-arse people you will ever meet. So all that stuff about being attacked, obviously, that's what comes with the job. Obviously, I knew it was going to happen. It was just to say the vociferousness of it that took me by surprise, especially when I was actually, obviously, blowing the whistle to protect human life. Now, those people who refused to expose that truth about what I was saying joined the conspiracy. As I say, you join the conspiracy by your actions. Anything other than trying to expose the conspiracy means you are part of it. So all those journalists who wrote articles critical of me and tried to downplay my information can be tried for conspiracy to be part of those terrorist attacks, basically. They joined the conspiracy and they should face the lengthy prison sentences that people are given for terrorism or conspiracy to cause terrorism. I've got a particular problem with Paul Dacre of the Daily Mail. I think he was one of the intelligence services men in the newspapers. You have to understand the intelligence services have agents within the entire media. This is how they managed to get the media to come round to their thinking.
Do you believe now that MI5 are just a high elite mafia gangster organisation, or do they actually serve the public interest?
MI5 don't serve the public interest. MI5, like all corporations, is mainly concerned with its own reputation and power, basically. And that's the same for every corporation. Government, as it's currently constituted, is a criminal gang. It's a criminal gang that is essentially stamping on our true rights under the law. Legislation cannot excuse you from that. All the legislation we see passed, although it's presented as being for the people, is always in the interests of powerful people and big corporations. So government, it's out and out pure evil. We currently live in a society where the government thinks it's okay to drop white phosphorus on kids. I can't get my head around that. I can't get my head around anybody who would think that you must do anything. You've got to do everything to expose that. We have to stop that happening again, and we didn't. Time and time again, the Israelis have dropped bombs and chemical weapons upon the people of Gaza. This is absolutely abhorrent. And again, the government has gone after various people like Saddam, gone after Syria because of the suspicion of chemical weapons. Not even being used, suspicion they've got them. And yet Israel is allowed to get away with dropping white phosphorus on kids, which was also done by the coalition in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is what I'm saying about people now who are paying money to the government. They are part of that conspiracy. And the only way you can avoid that karmically is to extricate yourself from that conspiracy. You stop paying your taxes to them, you stop paying your mortgage to the banks who are also behind this stuff. And anybody who thinks, so I might lose my house, well, be tested like that. Much better you lose your house in the long term and get a place in heaven than it is you keep your house and spend an eternity suffering.
I mean, what hope do you feel other whistleblowers have? Would you advise that that a person should whistleblow because of their moral conscience?
I advise anybody to blow the whistle who knows about anything seriously going wrong. They may do all sorts of things to you. They may even kill you. But in the spiritual long term, it is far better to be a martyr for the truth than it is to be a conspirator against mankind, causing murder and torture and mayhem. Simple as that.
Now, what happened when you went on the run? Where did you go and how long were you on the run for?
We were actually on the run for about a month or so, moving from hotel to hotel. We were moving around the south of France. We obviously adopted techniques to avoid detection that we'd learned in the intelligence services. You know, don't use a bank card and a cash line machine, for example. Anything like that could obviously pinpoint where you are at a particular time. So we didn't do any of that stuff. In those days, you could still book in hotels and pay cash, you know, and so on. You didn't necessarily need to have a passport, things like that, which you couldn't do now, obviously. And eventually what happened was that Annie agreed to go back. Now, she'd actually blown the whistle a little bit in my support. In fact, famously that day, after I came back to Britain, I was in the office of the editor of the Mail on Sunday, and on his wall framed, he had 5 front pages. The first one is me saying I've got more disclosures. The second one is the government injunction. The third one is Annie saying she's got disclosures. The fourth one is Princess Diana in car crash. The fifth one is Princess Diana dead. It's just like a remarkable little vignette of what happened that night. So she had blown the whistle only a little bit, but because the Official Secrets Act says any disclosure is criminal, she was arrested on a return to the UK, basically. At this point, I'd arranged with a friend to get a farmhouse in the middle of France, a place called La Creuse. So she went back. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know whether they were going to arrest her and try and hold her on remand. But I went to this farmhouse. She was then released after a few hours on police bail, and was then able to come back and see me after a couple of weeks.
So they found you after 1 month in France, and then you were arrested?
No. They didn't know where we were. We by this point gone down to a place called Serre in the Pyrenees to get completely out of the way because it was heating up, obviously. And at that point, the journalist Nick Fielding from the Mail on Sunday came over, and Annie flew back with him to the UK, and I went up to La Creuse in France to go and live in this farmhouse. And then Annie joined me in the farmhouse about a week or so later. But completely in the middle of nowhere in France, completely in the middle of nowhere. A place called La Selle du Noise. And I lived there in hiding for about 10 months. Other disclosures did come out, and again they tried to discredit me. I said I'd initially blown the whistle about the Israeli embassy bombing because MI5 had not acted according to intelligence about a threat to the Israeli embassy. That attack had then happened, and the officer involved had tried to put the report in somebody else's cupboard to cover up their own mistake. Now obviously again I thought that was an example of MI5 not doing what it's supposed to do in terms of stopping terrorist attacks and protecting human life, and I had concern that the Israelis were on a particular threat need to know about that. However, the response of the new Labour government was to try and use a form of words that appeared to say that I was lying or had misrepresented that information. But in fact, when you read it properly, it didn't say that at all. Well, that was the headlines in the paper. Obviously, I'm in hiding. I'm not in a position to give interviews at the time to protect myself or to clarify the position on the record. But this was the new Labour government. Blair was elected on a platform of freedom of information, ethical foreign policy, human rights. This ticked all of those boxes. And yet he just turned around to 3 months in government and essentially said, no, I'm going to shit on the whistleblower. And this is why I got a heads up on Tony Blair before everybody else. In the late 90s, I was telling everybody this man's a crook, he's evil. And people say, oh, no, you're MI5, you're just trying to discredit him or whatever. In fact, the Guardian even put me in inverted commas when I said he'd be worse for democracy than Margaret Thatcher, making me look like a right-wing idiot. But of course, that has now come to pass. Everybody can see that Tony Blair is a crook, is a psychopath, is an extremely vain man who has no concern for human life and only concern for his own reputation.
Now, you were arrested in France, weren't you?
Yeah, what happened was I was still trying to get this story out about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. So we're now about 10 months after I'd originally blown the whistle. The Mail on Sunday appeared to have lost interest. And I used to work on the Sunday Times, so I got in touch with the Sunday Times to say, look, the Mail on Sunday is not covering this, but I've got a great story. After I did that, the Mail on Sunday got in touch again. I was like, shit. So what happened was I went up to Paris to see both newspapers, but playing one against the other, not letting each one know what was going on, just in case one of them pulled out and the other one could report it. At the same time, Richard Tomlinson, who's claimed to be a renegade MI6 officer, was in Paris. In fact, at one point, Annie phoned him in his hotel and said, and we agreed to meet. When she phoned him again to do the details of the meeting, the hotel was denying he'd ever been there. And it was only about 3 or 4 days later I found out when I was in prison. I saw an English newspaper, a French newspaper, saying he'd been arrested. But I think Richard Tomlinson was actually an agent of MI6 all along. He was not a genuine whistleblower, he was a disruption agent. So there was all this crazy stuff going on where at the time we didn't know where Tomlinson got, he just disappeared. I was playing MI5 against MI6 to try and get the story out. In fact, even on the night before the night of my arrest, I'd gone to watch Middlesbrough play a friendly on telly in a bar in Paris, and I'd met this guy from the International Herald Tribune by coincidence. So I told him the story. I told him about what happened to me, and I said, look, if this story doesn't come out in the British media, will you please try and publish it? And he kind of said yes. That night I went back to the hotel and I was arrested by the French secret police.
Okay.
Now they wanted to arrest me secretly. They said, where's your pièce d'identité, where are your papers? And I knew that my passport was actually in my home in La Creuse in France. It wasn't in Paris, but I said, oh, it's in the hotel room upstairs. So I knew they'd have to go up there and knock on the door, and Annie would therefore be alerted to my arrest. So there's this moment on a Saturday evening when the presses are rolling for the Sunday papers, where the journalist interviewed Annie very quickly and had a phone call to his editor saying, hold the front page. And the front page was, swoop on MI5 men in Paris.
Now, what did they say to you on the day of your arrest? What exactly did they arrest you for?
The French had no choice. If you make a case for extradition, the nation you're in has to arrest you and hold you until that extradition can be heard. So they had no choice in the matter. The French secret police, to start with, had been told by the British they were some kind of super spy, had been selling secrets, this sort of thing. Got talking to them. They actually took me back to the HQ. So we walk out in this lobby, and I said, I've been here before. Look at me like, what? I said, you have to mention me your colleagues in the Libyan section. We exchanged assessments about Libya a couple of years ago. So they kind of looked at me and realised that I was in their equivalent in Britain, and it all changed. It was all coffee, Coca-Cola and cigarettes, basically. And because they're secret police, they don't normally arrest people. They don't know how to fill in arrest paperwork, so it was almost comical. It was also comical because it was the 1st of August, which, if anybody knows the French, is the day that they all leave on their month's annual holiday, basically. So there's all these guys who are supposed to be going off on TGVs down to Marseille for a week in the sun, and their wives are phoning up saying, where the hell are you, kind of thing. So the whole thing had an air of comedy about it. But I was then put into the French criminal justice system properly, and it was pretty abhorrent, really. I was taken to a judge. I was not allowed access to a lawyer again because they said I was some kind of super spy. So the first I knew of going to prison was when I said to the guard, when am I seeing a lawyer? And he said, well, if you're back here, you're not seeing a lawyer, you're going to prison.
Is that not a crime against humanity, to deny justice to you as a human being?
What, to not allow me access to a lawyer?
Yeah.
Under their law it is, yes. But again, they use words cleverly. Access to a lawyer they call privilege. Not a right, it's a privilege. A privilege can be taken away. So, strictly speaking, under the rules of equity, they've done nothing wrong. under the rule of law I've done nothing wrong, and access to somebody who can check that I'm okay is a principle of the rule of law, that they're not holding you in some terrible circumstances. And of course you should be able to immediately prepare a defence to that incarceration, which of course they wouldn't do in France until the paperwork had been handed over. So the Brits took as long as possible to hand over the paperwork. This is how evil these people are. Rather than hear the case against people who are murderers and terrorists, funding our terrorist enemies, for Christ's sake, people who pose a direct threat to British life, they decided to keep a whistleblower in prison.
So you were not actually innocent until proven guilty in France?
You're not being tried for a crime, so the principle of innocence until proven guilty doesn't actually come on board. But the French have a different notion of what innocent until guilty is. They will lock you up until you're on trial. If you're found innocent, they will then compensate you for that incarceration, whereas in this country we won't do that. Nevertheless, the French do lock you up and ask questions later. And that's why I always say the Europeans pay lip service to rights over government. They don't have a real notion of rights over government like we have in the UK, the US and Australia, the Anglo-Saxon countries. And obviously I was held in this place in the Palais de Justice in France. I then went to a prison called La Santé. Obviously I was extremely worried about being attacked because if it gone out, I was a former MI5 officer. Fortunately I was put in a section of the prison known jokingly as the VIP section, where they keep the French bureaucrats. The French state, as you'll know, treats its bureaucrats very, very well, and even when they're in prison they seem to be under threat because they are agents of the state, so they put me in a separate section of the prison. So most of the people I was there with were white-collar criminals. I mean, there were still people there, but things like armed robbery and who worked for the state and so on. Nevertheless, they were people who tend to be educated and so on, and not prone to arbitrary violence.
So what was the food like in that prison, and how long were you there for?
Well, the French prisoners used to joke to me the worst thing in the world must be English prison food, given the quality of English food. I actually found the French prison food to be quite okay. It was probably about the standard of English school dinners when I was growing up, basically. So not brilliant, but not bad either. And then once every 2 weeks we'd actually get steak frite, would you believe? A very cheap cut steak, but nevertheless we got steak frite. And because I was a remand prisoner, I was allowed to have as much money paid into my prison account as I liked, into my what's called furlough, of course. The word furlough is a prison payment. It's a prison term like lockdown, showing us we're actually essentially prisoners of the state at the moment. But I was allowed to have unlimited money paid in. Annie had sold her story to the Mail on Sunday as a result of my arrest, and I have no problem with that. If they're going to arrest me, we need funds to fight them. And I have no problem taking money from the Mail on Sunday in the first place. I use that money to fight a good cause and expose the evil of the intelligence services, the fact they were murdering people. So she was like putting this money in my account, and I was allowed to order out food and stuff, order out for food and stuff. So I ate quite well. In fact, I spent more money in 4 months in a French prison cell than I did when I was free in my first term at university, basically. And so I kind of lived quite well. I could buy cigarettes and things. Cigarettes are currency in prison. Could have had any drug I wanted, but I made the decision not to take anything in prison because I thought they might try and use that against me. But it was weird things like I'd been interviewed by Time magazine just before my arrest, and they'd obviously published an article. So when I was in prison, there's a copy of Time magazine lying around, and somebody opens up, "You're in this!" And I always remember we had, in the French prison, it was much better. We were out of our cells 6 hours a day. There was a makeshift gym. Once a week we had an art teacher who came in and flicking through this Time magazine and goes, "It's you!" And I've got to say it was quite pleasant to have a female art teacher come in, because that was the only access we got to women in that time, basically. And curiously, over the course of the 4 months, I managed to work my art up to a standard that I was quite pleased with the game. It was very frustrating because it was only 3 hours a week, and anybody will tell you when you're trying to improve something, you should be doing it at least 3 or 4 times a week. So I'd make some progress, then I'd have a week away. I'd be slightly better when I come back to it, but not that much better. But nevertheless, the 4 months in prison, I got to a standard that I was quite pleased with again. And obviously, I would then pass my time in the cell by drawing and things like that, and writing letters and things, just trying to do anything to stop you from going mad. Being incarcerated is not a natural state. And I would say there is nothing better than that moment, or a few things better than the moment of freedom when you walk out of prison again. I've always in my life been very keen not to keep animals cooped up and give them as much freedom as you can, because it's not the natural state of any being to be locked up.
So how long were you in the French prison for? What happened and how did you get back to the UK?
Yeah, to be clear, in the French prison, I was also denied access to visitors as well as being denied access to a lawyer for 48 hours. I got to see my parents only after 2 months. Now, what they were trying to do here was psychologically break me. When you're in prison with a sentence, you're ticking off a day every day to when you're going to get out. When you're on extradition, there's no final date. You know, people in the French state were saying to me, oh, this could go on for 2 years, things like this, to try and essentially get you to crack, basically. Obviously, I'm made of sterner stuff than that. And what was ironic was as soon as the British made their case to the French almost just laughed, basically. There was indecent haste to have a proper hearing. And then I was called up to the court again, and the French declared my case to be political and therefore beyond the scope of extradition treaties. So the oldest democracy in the world, the first to have a written constitution, pipped the Americans by a few months, declared my case to be political, as it was. I wasn't there because I'd caused harm to other people. I was there because I'd embarrassed the British government. And I'd made it clear, obviously, during the extradition hearing that I was blowing the whistle on MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. Because what I've got to mention is while I was in the NIC, just to give context to my arrest, although I was going to see these journalists in Paris, I was going to see them because I'd sent a thing to Tony Blair outlining the plot, saying the intelligence services murdered innocent people. You need to know about this. And that was the point they put in the urgent extradition request. So rather than think, oh my God, look, intelligence services are causing all sorts of damage to human beings, they actually decided to go for the whistleblower. And then what had happened is I'd given an interview to Mark Urban of the BBC's diplomatic and defence correspondent, in the 10 months I was in hiding, and that was then shown on a Panorama special when I was in prison. 2 days later, without any inquiry whatsoever, Robin Cook, who at the time was the Foreign Secretary, went on television and said, this man is talking pure fantasy with no basis in fact. Now, obviously at that point everybody thought, oh, he's a fantasy, he's making it up to embarrass the intelligence services. But that gives you an insight into what the British government is like, how they are manipulated by the intelligence services. And obviously I found out about this stuff when the newspapers arrived in prison, a few days later. Now, having done everything to alert the government in any way, legally, as far as you can, and then being put in prison for it, I was not in a good mood, obviously. I was, being declared a political prisoner by the French. British government still wouldn't take my evidence, which is your duty to hear evidence. It's your duty about something like that. Of course it is. You have a choice to hear evidence about whether people are murdering people. The whole basis of society falls apart if people can choose to ignore the fact that people are being murdered. And again, if you say, well, they're Libyans, I just don't know how psychopathic you've got to be to do that. If somebody murdered your kids, would you want to know about it? When other people have done it, would you make sure it stops so other people don't suffer in the same way you do? You get the amount of morons that came to me, you signed the Official Secrets Act. Yeah, I signed the Official Secrets Act to keep lawful things secret. Not crimes, not murder, not, the fitting up of innocent people, basically. So there's just so many fucking morons out there really is. And many of them are in activist groups, that's the problem, in the political class. But anyway, to cut a long story short, I made a living for myself. I got a column with Punch magazine, got up their noses. I was briefing journalists about everything I needed to brief about. They were coming over to Paris to see me, doing stories in the British press. And I also put the MI6 document on the internet. There's an MI6 document, the CX report I referred to previously. Now, to be clear, when I blew the whistle, I'd given the documents to friends for safekeeping in case I was raided. And when we'd done the whistleblowing the mail on Sunday, my friends had handed the documents to the journalists. But my friend was moving house, and he phoned me up and said, I found some stuff in my bottom of my wardrobe, Dave. You know that stuff you get me to look after? I went, yeah. He goes, there's some of them left. I didn't hand them all over, I'm sorry. But has one of them got a series of funny numbers and letters across the top? And he went, yeah. And I thought, that's it, that's the telegram, that's the CX report with the Zulu time on it, as they call it. This is the evidence of MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. And it is prior to the attack happening, so it shows prior knowledge. It's not somebody trying to claim it afterwards, for example. And it showed that the agent was involved in the attack. He wasn't just reporting on it. So he through a series of, as it was in those days, fax machines, we shot it across the world, and it eventually alighted in the offices of a French journalist I knew, and I put that document on the internet. I make no apologies for that. It's extremely serious matters, funding our terrorist enemies and murdering people, and therefore I did that to expose the truth, and that was covered in the British media. Yet we still couldn't get any form of inquiry because Tony Blair is such an evil and vain and arrogant man, basically.
But can I just confirm with you, David, are you saying that the French refused to ship you back to the UK because you were a political
prisoner, yes.
Right, so do you think that helped you, and does that support the case for the whistleblower?
Well, I'll say if the oldest democracy we have in the world at the moment calls you a political prisoner, perhaps you might think that they have some experience of these things and are therefore protecting you, and therefore there is a lot of credibility to it. I also say as well, jokingly, as I'm part of the war that Britain and England and France have fought for the last 1,000 years on and off, in which they give safe haven to each other's dissidents. Famously, Thomas Paine, for example, was given safe haven in France. Voltaire was given safe haven in England. I was part of that grand tradition, which makes me very, very pleased.
Okay. So how did you end up coming back to the UK?
I got to the point where I couldn't really do anything more abroad. My PR agent at the time was trying to open up manoeuvres behind the scenes. And he said basically that they will give you bail if you come back, which had been my worry, was if I turned up they'd just keep me on remand in Belmarsh for 2 years before a trial. So once bail was on the cards, that was an issue I could deal with. So the decision was very quickly made for me to come back on that condition. But just to fill you in a little bit of a story here, there have been several attempts on my life. Just before I came back, something very suspicious happened. I went down with what I thought were flu symptoms. Now, I know that marijuana is a medicine. It's God's best medicine. Don't let anybody tell you any different. And so what I did was what I normally do with colds and flu. I made myself a marijuana tea. Now, you don't just put the marijuana in boiling water. You've got to heat up in some oil first so it decarboxylates. And then it becomes truly medicinal. You get it from smoking as well, not this is a joint. And so I just had a cup of this stuff. Next morning, 10 hours sleep, wake up right as rain. That's always been my experience with flu, colds. Marijuana kills it instantly. Annie then went down with the same symptoms, my girlfriend at the time. Now, she wouldn't take the marijuana tea to start with, but about 3 days in, she was getting worse and worse and started hallucinating. I thought, God, this is really serious. I made her drink some very strong marijuana tea. And it's carried on, and in the end, I had to phone at the French Health Service, and they sent out an ambulance straight away. It transpired that she had meningitis C. Now, when I went to the hospital, the doctor said to me, we can't understand what's going on here. She's got meningitis C, but she doesn't have septicemia. Her blood should be poisoned. Do you know why? And I'm sitting there thinking, does he know about the weed? Does he know about this or what? Don't know whether he did or not. I don't know if he's getting at that. But this clearly shows me the power of marijuana as a medicine. It actually stopped the septicemia, which can, of course, lead to lost limbs, brain damage, and so on from meningitis C. But what is particularly suspicious is that the French Health Service then phoned me up afterwards and said, where have you been? And I said, what do you mean? They said, we don't have this strain of meningitis in this country at the moment. You must have been somewhere. I said, I haven't. I've been stuck in, I can't leave France because I was scared in case I went to another country, they'd try and extradite me again. So I said, I've been in France. And they wouldn't believe me. They would say, well, no, you must have been abroad. I said, I haven't. And they said, we just don't have this strain of meningitis in France at the moment. So this is clear evidence this was introduced and was not an accident. Again, this gives you an idea what they are like. That they would give you something to knock your limbs off, to drive you mad. That's what these psychopathic people are. There'd also been a thing as well I'd had from a food poisoning, where I'd gone out and had a bad oyster. Now, again, same problem. My feet started to go numb, my legs started to go numb. I didn't know what was going on. I'd never had such severe food poisoning, but instinctively, decarboxylate the weed, drink that, hour and a half, right as rain, absolutely right as rain. But I've now done the research into that. That shellfish poisoning is designed to kill you very slowly. It slowly paralyses you, so it paralyses your chest and you die from not being able to breathe properly, which is a terrible, terrible death. This is the mentality of these people. Now, I'm not saying that's MI5 or MI6 even, I don't know. What I'm saying, though, is there are very dark people out there who are psychopathic, who take great delight in giving people slow and painful deaths to discourage other whistleblowers. And the fact the British government is not interested in that means that they are not performing their duties of protection to the British public and people. And they are psychopaths, so they've joined in with it, basically. So these are the attempts on my life. I mean, other ones, for example, like when I was going to see Mohammed Al-Fayed's security people talk about the death of Diana. The driver fell asleep at the wheel, hit the central reservation of the autoroute at 100 miles an hour. Fortunately, got the car back under control. But there's been other car things, classic things with brakes, things like that. Locking handbrakes. I've been in, I reckon, up to about 10 attempts on my life, basically. And the reason I'm here is purely by God's grace. If I've been a normal human being, hadn't been blowing the whistle, I'd be dead by now. So that gives you some insight. So yes, I came back in August 2000. My case was so prominent at the time, we had rolling news. When I got back to the UK, and again, the papers always misquote you. They always misquote you. I was misquoted that day by just about every newspaper I talked to make me look like a twat, basically. Got back, and the Metropolitan Police officer arrested me, apologised for arresting me.
What did he arrest you for?
He said, "I'm sorry, I have to arrest you on the 1989 Official Secrets Act." And I said, "I know, I understand you're doing what you have to do. I don't hold this against you." Police were very good. They booked me in, did the usual DNA and fingerprinting. And then they released me after a couple of hours. And I found out years later, after my trial, the special branch made a particular point about going to meet me to tell me in no uncertain terms they wanted absolutely nothing to do with my prosecution. My prosecution was entirely dictated by the new Labour government, basically. Because under the Official Secrets Act, it's the Attorney General, a member of the government, who gives a yay or nay to the prosecution. So this was a political prosecution carried out by a government that was conspiring with murderers in the intelligence services to cover up its own failings. This is the level of Tony Blair. You know, this is, again, if this had been exposed in the late 90s, that man would have been sacked. He would have been in no position to be able to wage war in the early noughties. And this is why the importance of listening to truth and listening to whistleblowers. We could have headed that whole thing off. And 9/11 as well. If the British Parliament had taken my evidence about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda, the nasties who carried out 9/11, which is not Muslims, obviously, couldn't have blamed Al-Qaeda, could they? Because it was in planning for a long time, 9/11. If they then said, "Oh, Al-Qaeda carried out this attack," and then people would say, "Well, hang on, didn't David Shayler say that MI6 are funding those people?" So we could have stopped 9/11 as well. And that is not fanciful. That is perfectly feasible if people had heard my evidence properly.
What do you think of Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party now, in light of the fact that he was Crown Prosecution Service at the time of Jimmy Savile?
Curiously, Keir Starmer was one of my briefs, one of my lawyers, would you believe? I had many of them, but he was one of them. So I do personally know Keir Starmer, and the man is an idiot. He's an absolute fucking idiot. That's the problem. The problem with the public school education system is it overeducates certain people. And I'm not saying that, you know, these people are defective because they haven't got that standard of academic education. I'm saying their talents lie elsewhere. Because not everybody has that ability to academically process. I have that ability, but I don't. It's one of the things I hold as one of my abilities. But I can also do other things, my hands and things like that. You know, I can paint and draw and make things. The problem with public school is it tries to get everybody up to that academic standard, even those who are not capable of it. And that's one of the key things they use to manipulate government. They put people in there like that who can't reason in that way, who'll just be good chaps and do the job. He is one of them. He's a man who couldn't think for himself in a million years. I don't believe he genuinely covered up these things. I believe that what he did was thought he was acting within the law, basically. But don't forget, he was also responsible for stopping the prosecution into Greville Janner as well, Lord Janner. He was also, remember, he should have been arrested and charged in Leicester many, many years beforehand. And that all started to come out again, and then suddenly he gets Alzheimer's. But Keir Starmer was also the DPP at that time. So Keir Starmer has covered up child abuse. And again, you don't need a lot to blackmail people. In that case, they can just basically start pointing the finger at, look, he's covered up the child abuse. And then people start putting two and two and they go, oh, look, he's a child abuser, sort of thing, you know. So this is how it works. This is why Keir Starmer is a completely and utterly ineffective leader of the opposition. I'd like to say he's a nice chap as well, but he isn't. He's barely human in some ways.
Okay. What do you know of Tom Watson, MP, previous MP?
Don't know a lot about Tom Watson as such. All I'll say is that when I came back to the UK, I lobbied people to try and hear my very serious evidence about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda and murdering people. And they were all too cowardly or too stupid to understand it, basically. And that is why I have no respect for the political class whatsoever. All of those people there are feathering their own nests. They're all multi-millionaires. How do they know to govern ordinary people? They're multi-millionaires, you know. You can't do it. You know, one thing about my life, I know what it's like to struggle to pay the rent, to struggle to pay for food, because I've been oppressed. So I therefore have some insight what it's like to be poor in this country. I've been removed from my home physically by people with unsigned documents. I therefore know what it's like to be subject to an unlawful eviction, basically. And you have to have those experiences to understand them. There's no way that someone like Tony Blair, whose entire life was laid down for him in terms of public school and Oxbridge and a nice job as a barrister in a chambers and so on, political career, that's all set out for him. That man's never struggled. He knows nothing about true spirituality. Yeah.
Now, when you were arrested, you were released on bail. Then there was a trial. What happened?
Let's be clear. They had a series of pre-trial hearings before my trial, in which you couldn't introduce evidence because it was a legal hearing. But as a result of the rulings from those legal hearings, I wasn't allowed to introduce the evidence in the trial. Now I say anybody who has any basic understanding what a fair trial is you are allowed to cross-examine your accusers to see whether they're telling the truth. That's how you get the truth. And you're allowed to speak freely in your own defence to explain why you did what you did and why what you did is lawful. That was cut off me completely. When I did get in the witness box in my trial eventually, I had to defend myself in court as well. When I got in the witness box, I did say I witnessed a crime so heinous I had to resign from the services, knowing the jury's ears would pick up, and they did. The jury obviously were interested, and I said to the judge, can the jury ask questions about this? They're interested. And he said no. That, again, is a violation of a fair trial. The jury are allowed to ask questions in a trial. We forget this, but they're the determinants of truth. If they are getting at something, they understand the truth, they are allowed to ask questions.
So were you essentially a litigant in person?
That's civil law. I'm being put on trial. I'm the accused. So I'm not a litigant in person. I was defending myself. They can't stop you defending yourself, because in the old days, when you had normal law, you didn't have legal systems and solicitors and barristers, people generally defended themselves, basically. But obviously by this time I was exhausted. They say spun this out for 2 years. Obviously at that point I'm trying to earn a living, it's difficult. I'd hoped that we'd convince them to do it. We'd done enough to stop them even going to trial, but they still nevertheless went to trial. But in fact they actually started the trial, would you believe, in September 2002. Now, anybody who remembers what was going on at the time will know that this is when the Iraq's weapons of mass destruction dossier came out. So what they effectively did was put me on trial, so I couldn't deal with that, basically.
Okay, but why did you decide to defend yourself and not use a Queen's Counsel, for example?
Because as a result of the pre-trial hearings, legally, I had no defence under their law. Therefore, no barrister could defend me. It would be contrary to his position within their courts, basically. So no barrister could defend me. I had to defend myself. And now I'm actually quite a good cross-examiner and quite a good public speaker. But I say I was exhausted by this time. But even then, pre-trial, I had one final legal argument with the judge, in which I absolutely ripped him apart with my arguments, absolutely ripped him apart. And he still refused to listen to what I had to say. He refused to rule upon the difference between national security and the national interest.
Are you inferring of common law here through that trial?
Which is the interesting thing, is I went into a full-on research of their law, not just the Official Secrets Act, and I found out about the common law. The only bit I did actually, this is one of the craziest things, is I went to the coronation oath, which is what shows you, one of the things that shows you that the law, not common law, small c, small l, that's a form of equity, it's no one of their contracts, but true law, which is sometimes known as common law, I didn't find the bits in their law where it came. I found it in the coronation oath, but not elsewhere, about where it's a higher law in the system. But I kind of forgot. I didn't realise the importance of it at the time. So I knew about common law, but I didn't quite get there with my own trial. And this is why I'm pushing common law now, is to keep people out of their courtrooms, basically. Because when you turn up to their courtroom, you are consenting to the legal system, and they say, therefore, because it's not binding, you've turned up for arbitrary judgment, because what do they like with you? Although they have all these supposed rules and so on, because you've turned up at court, you've effectively admitted they can do what they like to you. You're a slave.
But is it physically possible not to contract?
Yeah, don't go to court.
If you're physically forced into a courtroom by 2 guards, for example?
Well, then of course you wouldn't be entering by your own consent, but they would still, most people don't get dragged into a courtroom. I wasn't dragged into a courtroom, I walked in of my own free will, under an illusion, but nevertheless walked in under my own free will. This is why when I'm being evicted, I don't walk off the property. I make sure they carry me off the property, so there can be no doubt about consent. they will argue that somebody waves a piece of paper at you, you get up and walk off the property, you've consented. You've got no grounds in law. Whereas if you sit down and say, I'm sorry, your piece of paper is not signed, you have no lawful authority over me, and they literally physically carry you off the site, they have physically assaulted you, you're not giving consent. So my argument is that you swear an affidavit, don't go to the courtroom. All these people who come and will go to the courtroom, you have a bit of fun and a bit of theatre, it's not too serious, but if you haven't caused harm, loss or injury to your fellow man, swear an affidavit saying that, because a judge is bound by the oath ultimately, and he can only just actually decide a dispute between two men, not between a corporation and a man, because they're not equal.
Could you explain to the viewers what an affidavit is?
An affidavit is a sworn statement of law. It's sworn before God, but if you don't believe in God, you essentially affirm it, which has the same principle in law, and what you're effectively saying is that I will be judged on unlimited liability here if I've been telling a lie. Yeah. And that's the highest thing you can do in law, because it makes it clear, particularly if you've done it before God, that you're under the law of love your neighbour rather than under the legal system, basically. Anything else, any statement or anything else can be argued as part of the legal system, which is not binding, and I'm sure they can do what the hell they like. The law has some very clear binding principles. The law is paramount and mandatory as a principle of law. If you cause harm, loss or injury to your fellow human beings, you compensate them as any sane person would, unless you're a psychopath, of course. And that's law. The rest of it's not law. They've told it's law, but that's fraudulent. This is where you sometimes see out there people talk about the name being a fraud. It is. The name and the title are fraud, because they don't tell you that actually they are legal fictions and confer absolutely no rights whatsoever. And this is why we have a problem with things like the European Convention. The European Convention was drafted by communists, and it is an attempt to fake rights, basically.
Now, was there a point where you were put in prison in the UK?
Yeah, I was sentenced to 6 months in the end. Now, people wonder why I got such a short sentence. They've speculated that I'm still working in the intelligence services gave me a short sentence. The truth was, I spent 2 years going around trade unions, pressure groups, Liberty, everybody, telling everybody what I'd done. If they'd given me a long sentence, there would have been massive campaigns to have me freed. They didn't want that at the time, because they're trying to prosecute the war in Iraq. They don't like fighting on different fronts like that. So I got 6 months. They all took into account, of course, the time I'd spent in France, of which I was in Belmarsh for 3 weeks. Now, Belmarsh is a maximum security prison. This wasn't like in France in the VIP section, white-collar criminals. This was amongst people who were serial murderers, armed bank robbers, and so on. One thing I would say, though, is I have been to what's known as the Rainbow Family, one of these lovey-dovey sort of back-to-nature things. And everybody assumes these spiritual people are super compassionate people. But I will tell you, I've met rather more psychopaths in the Rainbow and rather fewer psychopaths in Belmarsh than you'd expect.
What sentence were you handed?
Yeah, 6 months, as I say, 6 months.
For
the Official Secrets Act,
right.
For 3 violations of the Official Secrets Act. But they wouldn't hear any arguments about how the telephone intercept against the Guardian journalist was unlawful, for example. And it was clear evidence it was unlawful. They hadn't checked public media first that would have explained she was fighting a libel action, therefore there was no need to tap her phone. But saying none of that was allowed. The judge, ironically, my judge was called Moses, would you believe? Judge Moses.
Can I throw in a question? Like, in both the French prison and UK prisons, how did the prisoners treat you? Were they interested in what work you had been doing, and that you had been a whistleblower? Were they respectful towards what you've done?
Yeah, in prison in France, it's quite funny. We used to watch the news, the French news, and if anybody of high profile had been arrested, we'd know next morning they'd be there with us for breakfast. And that happened with me. They all came up to me and said, "Oh, we saw you on the news last night." And obviously they knew I'd been a whistleblower. They could tell I'm not I wasn't a threat to anybody. They were very respectful of what I'd done. Obviously, being French, they have a natural antipathy towards the English anyway, so I was a bit of a hero from that point of view. So I was treated very, very well in the French prison on the whole, certainly by the other prisoners. Belmarsh, it was a bit more tricky. Obviously, you are the celeb in prison. People want to talk to you for that reason, but there's also people who want to hit you so they get in the headlines themselves, basically. And I had a thing with a guy from Northern Ireland where I couldn't see his tattoos, so I didn't know which way to go, and he was threatening me. But I actually do think I was looked after by the IRA in Belmarsh, because by this point I'd blown the whistle on the Bloody Sunday inquiry and how they were trying to frame Martin McGuinness, the head of Sinn Féin, for causing Bloody Sunday, the attack in Northern Ireland in 1972 when the British Army gunned down 13 Catholics in cold blood. They tried to blame the IRA. There'd been an inquiry shortly afterwards that had blamed the IRA, but people had, for 30 years, had been questioning this, relatives had been campaigning. And I was down to give evidence against the British Army. But they put me in prison. Now, obviously, this would be a great time to kill me. And I was protected by somebody I very strongly suspect was part of the RA, and that was part of my protection in Belmarsh. I have no problem with the RA. From my study of common law, I will tell you now, the IRA did not target civilians. They targeted buildings, and they targeted the people responsible for the occupation, i.e. soldiers and the politicians of the state that was occupying them. They have made themselves lawful targets by the unlawful occupation. So anybody, if people came to your house and waved guns at you telling you to get out, you're going to try and defend yourself and your family, you know what I mean? If you think that was violence, if you try to disarm those people or killed them, no, of course you wouldn't. And that principle works exactly the same in Northern Ireland, works exactly the same in Palestine, basically. So I now have enormous sympathy for the IRA. I know from investigating them that they are the most sophisticated armed resistance there's ever been, by a long, long way. They waged an amazing war against the British government, and they are the only people in my lifetime who genuinely got some concession out of the British government. Other people appear to have done at certain points, but usually they've used that for their own ends, basically. But they really got political change, and they did it through a sophisticated campaign of both the ballot and the bullet, basically. And that, I'm sorry, is the way it is. No great democracy has been created by a process of people sitting down and talking and having votes. Great democracies were created by wars and violent revolutions, as in France, as in America, as in virtually anywhere. So I will defend the right of a man to pick up a gun and defend himself, to remove an evil society so that his children have a chance to prosper. That is a perfectly natural human desire, basically. And anybody working against that is clearly a psychopath. He really has forfeited the right to life themselves.
Did you ever get any messages of support in Belmarsh prison from members of the public?
I got enormous support when I was in France to start with. I had about 200 letters from people.
From the French or the English?
The English. Lots and lots of letters of support from groups, from individuals and so on. My auntie's a Catholic, lit a candle for me in the church and so on. Yeah, I had a lot of support. I also had support when I was in Belmarsh as well, although by that time they were trying to obviously marginalise me as much as possible. The people I didn't get support from were the media, obviously. The media did very little to expose my unfair trial. In fact, they tried to deny me publicity at trial by having that trial with the Paul Borrell, Princess Diana's butler, who was accused of theft, and the Queen intervened in the trial. And if you remember that was at the same time as my trial, so they used that to obscure my trial. It was disgusting. No one who's got any respect for fairness or justice could support my trial. Nobody. And anybody who does, I'll put them on trial according to the same thing. Deny them a defence and see how they like it. Do as you would be done by. It's a very simple philosophy.
Did you ever come under threats from other prisoners in Belmarsh? I mean, did you suffer a lot of violence, and what was the food like in there? Belmarsh
is probably one of the worst places on earth I've been on. It's filthy. It's full of people who could, kill you at almost a moment's notice. I was playing pool with one guy, and I asked him when he was getting out. He said 2021. I later found out he was a serial killer. But he shouldn't have been in Belmarsh. He should have been in a mental institution. He wasn't all right, clearly. I had one situation as well where I'd been queuing up to use the phone for about half an hour, and this guy suddenly tries to push it in front of me, and the whole place goes quiet like in one of those Wild West scenarios. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, if I back down now, they're all going to bully me. So I just turned around to this guy and said, no, I'm using the phone, thinking he might hit me, whatever, I don't know, and made the phone call. But the fact I faced him down meant that I think other prisoners were not prepared to challenge me, basically. But I say I was threatened by people in Belmarsh, no doubt about it, yeah.
Is it true that the prisons are all contracted out privately?
Well, this is what we have now, private prisons. Now, again, people should not be making money off prison. Prison should be an issue of justice. People should only be put in prison insofar as they are a threat to other human beings. The idea you can imprison somebody for the possession of cannabis, for example, or even dealing in cannabis, to me, that again, you've got to be a psychopath to want to put somebody in prison who doesn't pose any threat to human beings. Why would you want to do that for? Why? Why do you want to put people in prison at the cost of taxpayers, often poor people, trying to work every hour God sends to make ends meet? Why should they be taxed to keep people in prison who don't pose a threat to anybody? That is, as far as I'm concerned, psychopathic and asinine.
And is it true there's a mandate, a financial reward scheme for keeping people in prison?
Yeah, this is why we've got longer and longer prison sentences, basically. So they make sure there's a good throughput of prisoners into prisons so people can keep making money out of private prisons. But my argument is anybody involved in the private prison network, come Judgment Day, is going to be in the wrong place, basically, unless they repent over that, which of course they won't, because they're, generally speaking, rich, psychopathic people. But that's part of what is wrong with our whole system, is that the idea that you can be put in prison simply for infringing a rule of legislation without causing harm to your fellow man, that is what is entirely wrong.
Was your food ever tampered with?
Don't think the food was tampered with, but the quality of food in Belmarsh was absolutely appalling. Really was.
How so?
Well, things like you get a tiny bit of meat like that, basically. Potatoes that were not even chopped, being boiled, partly boiled, things like that. It just basically wasn't enough nutrition. I mean, I was allowed, because I was a convicted prisoner, I was allowed £10 furlough a week, which barely took care of my tobacco allowance. Fortunately, I did that thing of the white collar. I looked at other prisoners' legal papers and tried to help them, because although these guys get appointed a state solicitor, those guys aren't working for them. They pay a bit of lip service to it, but they just want to get the money, don't they? They're not going to stand up for these people. So I'd go through their cases and write things for them, and for that they would pay me with tobacco.
Did your physical health suffer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wasn't getting proper nutrition.
Were they using GMO foods in prisons?
I've no idea whether it was GMO or not. I don't know. All I would say, it was terrible, terrible food. Barely fit for a human.
How did you begin to, how did your health descend into what it did?
Well, the problem with the descent of your health, you're not being properly nourished, you're not getting proper exercise because you're only allowed out for an hour a day. Otherwise, you're 23 hours in a cell, 10 by 8, with two other guys. This is a cell designed for 2, not 3 people. I obviously came across things like people doing heroin in front of me and things like that, chasing the dragon. All sorts of stuff. My health deteriorated in Belmarsh, there's no doubt about that.
Were you allowed to do any art or anything like that?
There was nothing like art or anything like that at all. You were occasionally allowed to do a bit of work, for which you were paid some tiny amount of money, basically. But even that became a problem, because I would occasionally get threatened by other prisoners, basically.
Were you allowed access to any books?
Theoretically, yes, but in practice, no. I was fortunate I had obviously people visiting me, bringing me books and things like that. But there wasn't a lot of that going on in Belmarsh. There really wasn't.
So no library?
There was, but getting access to it was very difficult, you see what I mean? It was the same with the idea on Sundays you were allowed out yourself for an extra hour if you went to the Sunday service, for example. But I wasn't religious at the time. Even as much as I'd like to get out of the cell, I thought it'd be hypocritical as an atheist to go to a Sunday service just to get out of the cell.
And what about the general mental health of the other prisoners? How was that?
Well, I'd say there's certain ones there that were either institutionalised. There was a guy there who had done a 14-year stretch for essentially burgling the Sultan of Brunei. He'd been then out of prison, so he'd been in prison he got to prison when he was 18. 14 years of his life he's been in prison, so nearly half his life he's been in prison. When he comes out, what's he going to do? He doesn't know how to live anymore. Gets no support, so he goes and commits another crime and he's back in Belmarsh. I saw young kids there who shouldn't be in prison. The idea that prison is an academy of crime. Of course, people told me all sorts of stuff about car crime, burglaries, which I could have used if I'd been of that mentality, basically. After 7 weeks, they sent me to 3 weeks. They sent me to Ford Open Prison, and that was where I learned all about fraud. They're all white-collar criminals there, basically. And Ford's a very peculiar prison because it's an open prison. One of my jobs involved doing the car park outside the prison. So every morning I get a bin liner and walk outside the prison gates and go and clear up the car park and then come back in again. But even then, they posted a guy there. And in fact, this guy I'd met in Belmarsh, and he said, "Oh yeah, I came to the end of my sentence. I got sent to Ford." I said, "Don't send me to Ford. I'll run." So what they did, sent him to Ford. He runs. He gets the year for running, basically. So he's back in Belmarsh. But Ford, at least I remember getting off the meat wagon at Ford and seeing like proper green grass for the first time in a while. And the fact the guards would call you Mr. Shayler rather than by your surname, and you'd start with a pack there with a bit of chocolate and tobacco in, they'd obviously be taking out your furlough, but nevertheless you started off with that there. I felt myself actually thawing, and I realised that the 3 weeks in Belmarsh I had been living in an animal state of consciousness, a state of fight or flight, full of adrenaline, thinking if someone's going to attack me, I've got two options. I'm going to have to hit them very hard first, or I'm going to have to run away. But that animal level of consciousness, I realised suddenly at 4 that I suddenly went woof, and literally felt my humanity come back. Now, you put people in that system for years and years and years, you can turn them into psychopaths, as simple as that. Prison does not work, basically.
How do you contrast the Scandinavian prisons to the UK prison service?
Well, traditionally European prisons have been much more focused on rehabilitation. The sentences are nowhere near as long. It's in America and Britain you get long prison sentences, but I think that's to do with the privatised prisons more than anything else, and more to do with some inane people amongst the population who think that their revenge is more important than justice, and that they think people should be locked up no matter what. I think every man should be given his chance to repent over what he's done, but that requires a process, somebody to do something with him and show him what he's done is wrong, if he has caused harm. If he's in there for selling drugs, I'm sorry, he hasn't caused harm to a human being. I don't care if he's been selling, unless he's been forcing that on someone else. You have a choice about whether you put that needle in your arm. That's your responsibility. So the guy who's sold that is not causing harm, loss or injury. And again, if it was legal, it would cost 13p a go or something. When on the street cost £10 a go. This is why you have to steal things. It creates more crime.
So on average, how many people were in the Belmarsh prison for example, murder, burglary, in contrast to, for example?
Well, they're kept in a separate section. They're called Section 44. Now, obviously, in prison, they are. It's always in society, people want something to look down on, whether they are, basically. And prisoners, no matter what they've done, whether they're murderers or whatever, look down on. This is why they put in their own section for protection, basically. And they did try and do that when I arrived in Belmarsh. They tried to put me with my own protection. I'm not having that. They'll put it in the press, implying I'm basically. And I don't want to mix. Simple as that. I can understand most criminals. I understand that people without opportunities in life, young lads who've never had an opportunity, might be tempted to steal and so on. If I'd grown up in a council estate with no opportunities, I would have been tempted to do the same. I would at least been a bloody dealer. It's only because I had an education and had opportunities in life I could fulfil my potential. But those guys didn't have that opportunity. They're not evil people. They're people who have denied circumstances to make themselves good people.
So how did you manage to evade being put with the prison?
I just said to them, I don't want that. I'm very happy to not be put somewhere for my own protection. I will take my chances. I will take my chances. But yeah, so they're kept away from everybody else. They really are.
You've been called the original Julian Assange. What do you make of him?
Right, I'm going to tell you the truth about Julian Assange as I understand it from my research and so on. But Julian Assange was arrested in the 1990s in Australia for essentially computer hacking. He was a young man at the time, and what actually happened was that he was threatened with extradition to the US, where they could have put him away for a very long time for what he'd done. This is a classic intelligence police approach to get people to work for you. So I think to start with, Julian Assange was working for the other side, putting out low-level information that looks like it's really exciting, but actually isn't really that exciting at all. And that prevailed for a while until the late noughties, when, to use an intelligence phrase, he went native. He suddenly realised that actually, he was part of this terrible system that was manipulating things, and I believe that the real Julian Assange is now dead, because one day I used to follow WikiLeaks on Twitter. There was a tweet with just all these numbers and letters on it. It's like, I thought, that's got to be code for something. Now, everybody in those positions has what's called a dead man's trigger, dead man's chest. And that is, what you hold over the intelligence services, if you kill me, this information will come out. Because I have to be alive to stop it coming out every day or whatever it is, every week. You've got a thing where it will come out automatically unless you go in there and do something. You understand the principle, yeah? And I think that's what that tweet was all about with Assange, and it was shortly after that the Vault 7 stuff came out, which was about Pizzagate and the and so on, and the CIA and some really hardcore CIA stuff. Up to that point, WikiLeaks to me was all part of the picture. It was nothing really. I mean, there's stuff about war crimes, but we know about war crimes. It wasn't really adding that much to what we knew about the US. Whereas this stuff did. This stuff was fingering people like Tony Podesta and so on. And again, the mainstream media reaction has been absolutely appalling. To pretend that anybody who's interested in Pizzagate is some sort of conspiracy nut and has got it wrong. You need to see the pictures on those Instagram accounts. Now, obviously, I do believe in the freedom of speech and the freedom of artistic expression. But I want to wonder why people like that had such weird pictures of kids. That is grounds for reasonable suspicion to investigate somebody for. And of course, the authorities won't do that because what they use to blacken people's characters. One of the most appalling things that's ever happened is that the public figures who came to attention in Operation Awe, which was an FBI investigation in which they lured to a website, got their credit card details and then put them on trial, has been made secret for 100 years. So all the public figures who were essentially came to attention to that operation are now being blackmailed to do the bidding of the elite, basically, because they know that if they don't, they will be exposed. And there's no coming back. I'm saying in the old days they used to expose people as homosexuals or having extramarital affairs, but nobody gives a damn about that anymore.
Do you think there's anybody in prison now that's not guilty of pedophilia, has been labelled by the UK government of these heinous crimes just to shut them up for whistleblowing, for example?
I think that's what they do, yeah, absolutely. I also think what they'll do is, where there's pressure on, say, high-profile figures, they'll find a fall guy and they'll frame him for it and say he did it. Oh, it's all dealt with now, he did it. But I also believe that part of the thing they do against public figures is the use of lookalikes. That they send in lookalikes to the kids, and the kids think they've been celebrities or politicians. That's another thing that confuses the picture, basically. The case I remember at its most famously was, I remember because it again knocked us out of the headlines in the early noughties. The News of the World was about to do a series on my whistleblowing, and that was the weekend that the Hamiltons, remember the Hamiltons? The guy was a Conservative MP, Neil Hamilton, his terrible wife. They were arrested for their role in, and the police took it very seriously.
Which police?
I think the Met were investigating it. Took it very seriously at the time, and you could see they thought that these people were telling the woman who was complaining about the assault was telling the truth. And obviously, from her point of view, she was telling the truth, but I actually believe they used a lookalike in those cases to blacken up Neil Hamilton and his wife. And then, of course, they can use that also to knock us out the headline. Neil Hamilton's been arrested for... So the News of the World didn't run the articles about me. But that, again, gives you all sorts of insight into how they work. Lookalikes, manipulation of the media, all that sort of stuff, basically. So what ultimately happened with Assange is I believe he was killed. Now, again, you're going to have to bear with me on this one. That what happened was Pamela Anderson was used to kill Julian Assange. She was famously taking him food in the Ecuadorian embassy. Now, I don't think she was in on it. This is what people don't obviously always understand about the intelligence service. They think someone's involved in something. They're conscious. They know what they're doing. But I think what happened was they slipped some kind of poison into the food that she was taking. She didn't know that. And that's what killed Julian Assange. The man who is now in Belmarsh, who was photographed being arrested at the Ecuadorian embassy, is a lookalike. But they've also replaced Pamela with a lookalike. I saw by accident one day, I was in a hotel and I flipped the telly on and there was an interview on GMTV with Pamela Anderson. It wasn't her, it didn't even look remotely like her, really. And that's a lot of the lookalikes. When you compare them with the actual people, you can see they're lookalikes, but generally speaking, they look so like them that it's only when you put the two together you realise that's the case. So what happened was essentially Julian Assange was replaced by a doppelganger, and this is borne out by the initial press photographs from being taken out of the Ecuadorian embassy looked far less like Assange than those pictures when they were subsequently published. They'd obviously clearly superimposed Assange's face on there. So in summary, Assange was working for them. He was an agent trying to essentially manage things from their point of view. He turned on them. For that he had to go to the Ecuadorian embassy, and then they murdered him. And the person who, if he is in Belmarsh, is some kind of lookalike. This is why they're trying to keep his family away from everybody else, because it's not Assange, simple as that. So in the end he got there. And also with Assange, using common law, I tweeted him about using affidavits. Sure enough, he tweets out a few weeks later a sworn affidavit. That was the point the Swedish dropped the case against him. The British wouldn't drop the case against him because he jumped bail. Although I would argue that if there's no case against him in the first place, there's no bail to be jumping. But that's how they carried on the case against him. But he had sworn under oath, and that had obviously dealt with the situation with the Swedish police. Because the allegations against me, looked at them, were, again, risible rape allegations. They really were. They're clearly women who'd been sent in to blacken his character, basically. So yeah, that's where we are with Assange. And again, I will stand by that story. It's very difficult to obviously prove. It's one of those things where you need to get above things and look at things very objectively, timings, patterns, and apply your knowledge of how the world works. And I say using dupes to assassinate people is one of the things they do, and using lookalikes is one of the things they do. These are the things that cause the most confusion. Do
you think whistleblowers have any hope in any country for protection against political weapons of warfare?
We are opposed to an international world conspiracy. So there is no protection for whistleblowers in any country whatsoever. In fact, any whistleblower who looks like they're getting away with it too much, it's got to be a psyop. It's got to be a front, basically. They're not a real whistleblower. And again, I think with Snowden, I'm pretty much convinced the man who was interviewed in Hong Kong is not the same man who's now in Russia, that something happened in the intervening period. And therefore, the Snowden we know today is not the same Snowden who initially gave the interview and blew the whistle. And that was quite mad. I mean, I remember first seeing the Snowden thing. I remember seeing a link online and clicking on it, and there's this bloke in a hotel room being interviewed blowing the whistle. I'm watching it, thinking back to Newsnight 1997 with me sitting in a hotel room blowing the whistle. Yeah. And one of the really curious things is there was a statue, bronze statues put up in, I think it was Berlin, I think it was. And they've got an empty plinth, they've got Assange, Snowden, Manning, and there's an empty plinth there. And it's almost like saying, there's a man here who did this first. And I've even seen a picture of Annie standing there on that empty plinth because she lived in Berlin. It's almost like somebody saying to you, look, there's something going on here. So yeah. But all these people who blow the whistle, they're blowing the whistle on the murder of human beings. War crimes. I'm sorry, oppressing people who are blowing the whistle on things like war crimes is evil. It's out and out pure evil. If anybody else have anything to do with people like that has got to seriously question what the hell they're playing at. Obviously, from the point of view of the spiritual journey, those people have done the very best things. They have sacrificed their lives for truth and justice. There is no greater calling to God than that. And the people who've done the opposite, I say, come Judgment Day, really will be the lowest of the low. I say, and those who've covered up, you know, I would say, let karma deal with them. Karma will deal with them best. And they will truly know for an eternity what they did wrong.